Keanu Reeves stepped into one of the most luxurious restaurants in the heart of the city, where crystal chandeliers cast dazzling reflections on fine wine glasses and elegant suits. In stark contrast to the opulence around him, he wore a wrinkled shirt, simple jeans, and a pair of worn-out shoes, as if he had just stepped out of an ordinary day. With a calm demeanor, he made his way to a secluded table in the corner, avoiding attention amidst the lavish setting of the elite. But before he could even place an order, a waitress appeared. Her gaze swept over him with thinly veiled contempt, her lips curling into a condescending smirk. "Are you sure you can afford to eat here?" Her voice was sharp, laced with mockery, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. A few chuckled, amused by the situation. But what happened next didn't just leave the entire restaurant in stunned silence. It revealed a truth that changed everything. Before we continue the story, let us know where you're watching from. If you love inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any upcoming content. Beverly Hills shimmered under the glow of extravagant neon signs, luxury cars cruising slowly, their polished exteriors reflecting the opulence of the city's upscale streets. At the center of this grandeur stood Lumiere, a restaurant that epitomized sophistication. It wasn't just a place to indulge in exquisite cuisine, it was a stage where the wealthy flaunted their status. Inside, crystal chandeliers hung high, casting a warm, golden glow that reflected in the delicate wine glasses. Each table was meticulously arranged, pristine white tablecloths, gleaming silverware, and fresh flowers replaced daily. The soft melodies of a grand piano intertwined with the murmured conversations of diners dressed in the finest evening gowns and tailored designer suits. And then, the glass doors of Lumiere swung open. A man walked in. He didn't radiate the same glamour as the other guests. No designer suits, no diamond-studded watches, no polished leather shoes. Instead, he wore a wrinkled button-up shirt, faded jeans, and scuffed shoes with frayed edges. His slightly tousled black hair framed a face that held a quiet, unshakable calm. Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world. Yet, not a single person in the restaurant recognized him immediately. He moved with an unhurried grace, not out of discomfort, but because places like this were not unfamiliar to him. In fact, he was one of Lumiere's co-owners. But tonight, he simply wanted to enjoy a quiet meal like any other guest. His eyes swept over the space, unbothered by the curious glances and silent judgment flickering in the eyes of some nearby patrons. At the hostess stand stood Ashley, one of Lumiere's senior waitresses. She took immense pride in working at one of the city's most prestigious establishments, and she never hesitated to let that show in her demeanor. With her hair perfectly tied up, her uniform impeccably pressed, and her sharp eyes brimming with calculation, she had developed an instinct for assessing customers the moment they walked through the door. And when her gaze landed on Keanu, a flicker of disdain crossed her face. He looked too ordinary, too out of place. Ashley's lips curled slightly as she instantly made her judgment. Another homeless guy who wandered in? Or just some nobody trying too hard to fit in? Without bothering to hide her disapproval, she stepped forward, plastering on a fake smile. Her voice, smooth yet cold, rang out clearly, ensuring those nearby could hear every word. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Her words cut through the air like a blade, followed by a few quiet, amused chuckles from some of the guests. A few conversations paused as heads turned toward the unfolding scene. What they didn't realize was that they had just made a grave mistake. Ashley scanned Keanu from head to toe once more, her scrutinizing gaze lingering on his worn-out shoes, as if that single detail alone was enough for her to conclude that this man did not belong here. A smirk flickered across her lips, her sharp eyes gleaming with unveiled mockery. Deep down, Ashley found the situation in front of her amusing in the cruelest way. A man, dressed simply, with not a single sign of luxury or status, had stepped into Lumiere, a place where every detail, from the way napkins were folded to the way light reflected off wine glasses, exuded meticulous sophistication and class. She didn't need to think twice before categorizing Keanu among those who don't belong here. When Keanu, with a composed demeanor and a faint smile, confirmed that he wanted to dine here, Ashley tilted her chin slightly and turned toward the reception desk with deliberate slowness. Her fingers slid across the touchscreen reservation system, not out of actual necessity. She knew full well that a man like him wouldn't have a name on the VIP list or even in the standard reservation log. But rather than rejecting him outright, she savored the moment of prolonged ridicule. She intentionally pretended to search longer than necessary, leaving a deliberate silence hanging in the air, long enough for a few nearby diners to glance over, intrigued. When, unsurprisingly, the name Keanu Reeves failed to appear on the screen, Ashley curled her lips into a smirk, her voice ringing out with deliberate enunciation, each word dipped in thinly veiled contempt. "Just as I thought. You don't have a reservation. We do have a few open tables, but I must warn you, this isn't exactly a casual diner." Her tone was sweet yet sharp, like a sugar-coated blade. For a fleeting moment, the atmosphere seemed to tighten. A few patrons nearby exchanged amused smiles, while others watched with interest, entertained by the sight of an outsider daring to step into the world of the elite without the proper credentials. But contrary to Ashley's expectations, the man before her showed no sign of discomfort or embarrassment. No shame, no averted gaze, none of the reactions she was used to seeing from those who lacked the necessary status but still attempted to force their way into a world that wasn't theirs. Keanu simply smiled. No justification, no protest, just a calm, polite smile, one that carried an understanding beyond the moment. His composure didn't soften Ashley's demeanor. In fact, it only irritated her further. A normal person, when faced with such treatment, would at least show some hesitation or unease, perhaps even anger. But this man, with his steady gaze and unshaken demeanor, acted as if he were completely unaffected by the sharp-edged words she had deliberately thrown his way. Ashley crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. The smirk on her lips faded, replaced by a challenging glare. She wanted to push him, to see a crack in that serene expression. "So, you still want to eat here?" she asked, a touch of mockery still laced in her voice. Keanu nodded lightly, unwavering. "Yes." Ashley blinked, frowning slightly. By now, she had expected him to back down, or, at the very least, hesitate. But he didn't. She inhaled sharply before exhaling in a short, dry laugh, as if she had just heard something absurd. No longer interested in prolonging this pointless exchange, she turned abruptly and grabbed a menu from the counter. But instead of handing it to Keanu politely, she let it drop onto the counter carelessly, leaving him to pick it up himself. She glanced around, noting that several guests were still watching. That only strengthened her resolve to assert her authority. Before Keanu could react, she continued in a tone dripping with condescending pity. "I can take you to a more suitable spot. Follow me." She didn't wait for his response. Instead, she spun around, striding forward with brisk, forceful steps as if to emphasize that she was the one in control of this situation. Keanu said nothing, merely following in silence. But in his eyes there was a faint glimmer, a quiet, sharp observation. Ashley walked with steady strides, her back straight, chin slightly raised, as if she were escorting an important guest to a private section reserved for the most elite patrons of Lumiere. But, in reality, she was leading Keanu away from the heart of the restaurant, the area where the golden glow of chandeliers reflected off delicate crystal glasses, where well-dressed diners indulged in elaborate meals amid an atmosphere of pure sophistication. Without giving her guest a choice, she headed straight for the farthest, most secluded corner of the restaurant, an area no one wanted to sit in. It was near the kitchen, where waitstaff moved in and out in a constant stream, where the sharp clang of pans and the rhythmic chopping of knives filled the air, blending with the hurried voices of chefs hard at work. There were no glimmering lights here, no artistic paintings on the walls, nothing that exuded the prestige and exclusivity Lumiere prided itself on. Ashley stopped in front of a small table, not one draped in pristine white linen or set with meticulously arranged silverware, but the simplest, most inconspicuous table in the restaurant, hidden from the sight of esteemed guests. She turned to face Keanu, arms crossed over her chest, her eyes gleaming with a thinly veiled amusement laced with mockery. "This is the perfect spot for you." Her words were deliberately drawn out, each syllable dripping with derision, as if this was the only place someone like him could possibly belong. Without bothering to conceal her disdain, Ashley picked up the menu and flicked it onto the table carelessly, not even pretending to place it properly as she would for other guests. She glanced at Keanu, waiting for a reaction, a slight hesitation, a displeased frown, some sign of resistance. But he did nothing. He didn't appear offended, nor did he react the way she had anticipated. Instead, he simply smiled, a light, effortless smile, as if he had just heard an amusing but ultimately trivial remark. A flicker of irritation crossed Ashley's face. She was too accustomed to controlling situations, too familiar with guests who faltered, hesitated, or even flushed with embarrassment when they realized they did not belong here. But this man, he was too calm. As she turned away, Ashley stole a glance at a couple seated nearby, regular patrons of Lumiere, the kind who frequented the restaurant and spent without a second thought. The woman, dressed in a deep red evening gown, swirled her cocktail leisurely, her eyes twinkling with amusement at the scene unfolding before her. Ashley leaned slightly toward them, lowering her voice just enough for them to hear. "I bet he'll leave the moment he sees the prices on the menu." The woman let out a soft, knowing laugh. The man beside her merely smirked, swirling his wineglass lazily without even bothering to turn his head. Satisfied, Ashley felt as though she had just orchestrated a bit of entertainment for Lumiere's elite guests. She could already picture the outcome. A few minutes from now, the man would lower his gaze, set the menu back on the table, his hands tightening slightly in hesitation. Then, in an attempt to leave without drawing attention, he would push back his chair quietly and walk out, just like so many others who had come here and realized they did not belong. But once again, Keanu surprised her. He did nothing. No sign of discomfort, no awkward hesitation. Instead, he calmly flipped open the menu, skimming through the pages with a casual ease, as though he were simply browsing, completely unbothered. The numbers printed beside each dish were anything but ordinary. They were the kind that made most people swallow hard, the kind equivalent to a month's salary for the average worker. filet de Rossini with Wagyu. 5 beef and foie gras, $350 per serving. Beluga caviar, $500 for a small portion. A glass of Chateau Margaux vintage wine, over $2,000 a bottle. Yet none of these numbers seemed to faze Keanu. He didn't glance around as if searching for a more affordable option, nor did he appear to be debating whether he should continue. He simply read the menu, exactly as any diner looking to enjoy a meal would. Ashley lingered nearby, waiting for that inevitable moment when he would place the menu down, push his chair back, and leave. But that moment never came. Keanu continued scanning through the menu at his own pace, his eyes reflecting a quiet curiosity, as if he were thoughtfully considering his options rather than worrying about the prices. His patience never wavered. Instead, it was Ashley who began to feel her own patience fraying. She didn't understand. Why wasn't he reacting? Why wasn't he surprised or uncomfortable? Why wasn't he doing what every outsider did, standing up and leaving? Biting the inside of her cheek, Ashley turned on her heel and briskly walked toward the counter. But even as she moved away, she couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that lingered in her mind. There was something different about this man, and that made Ashley feel deeply, inexplicably uneasy. Ashley walked back with slow yet deliberate steps, each movement exuding confidence and control. She wasn't in a hurry. There was no reason to be. Deep down, she believed that the psychological game she was orchestrating would soon reach its inevitable conclusion. A man like him would eventually recognize his own misplacement and quietly retreat. However, as she approached the table, Keanu was still there. His posture remained unchanged, his expression devoid of hesitation or discomfort. While others in his situation might have averted their eyes, trying to escape the mocking glances around them, he remained entirely composed, sitting as if this were the most natural thing in the world. Ashley crossed her arms over her chest, tilting her head slightly, her lips curving into a smirk laced with amusement and condescension. Her voice rang out, each word laced with feigned concern, but beneath that layer was a clear challenge, like a cat toying with a mouse before delivering the final bite. "Have you made up your mind yet? Or should I suggest something more affordable?" She knew exactly what effect those words would have. Normally, people in this situation would start feeling uneasy. They would chuckle awkwardly, pretend they hadn't fully grasped the menu, or, worse, hurriedly flip the pages in search of a cheaper option to save face. And that was when Ashley would deliver the final blow, not through words, but through a look, one filled with carefully disguised pity, forcing them to feel the weight of their own embarrassment. But things didn't go as she expected. Keanu lifted his gaze, his eyes so calm that, for a fleeting second, she felt uncertain about what she had just said. There was no hesitation, no nervousness, no trace of insecurity. With a steady hand, he pointed at a dish on the menu, his voice carrying not the slightest tremor. "I'll have the filet de Rossini." The air seemed to still for a moment, partly because of how unwavering his response was, and partly because of the dish itself. Filet de Rossini, one of the most expensive items at Lumiere. Ashley blinked once, as if ensuring she had heard correctly. In all her years working here, she had encountered plenty of wealthy clients who still opted for modest spending. People who chose dishes based on price rather than preference. Some even came to Lumiere just to take pictures, ordering the cheapest item to keep up appearances. But this man, someone she had been certain didn't belong in this world, had just ordered one of the most extravagant dishes on the menu without batting an eye. A faint smile ghosted her lips, but this time it wasn't one of derision. It was something else, curiosity mixed with intrigue. "You do know that dish costs $350, right?" Her voice no longer carried the same saccharine pretense as before. Instead, it had sharpened, laced with unmistakable challenge. The nearby diners, who had already been observing the interaction, leaned in slightly, their interest piqued. To them, this wasn't just a dinner. It had become a social spectacle, a silent play unfolding before them with an outcome that seemed all too predictable. Yet Keanu remained unfazed. He didn't glance around to see who was watching. He didn't lower his gaze in discomfort. He didn't blink, didn't falter, didn't give any indication that he was scrambling for a way out. Instead, he merely smiled, a quiet, self-assured smile, and responded with a simple yet weighty remark. "Sounds great." The words left his lips with such ease, void of any tension or pretense, as if price had never been a consideration. Ashley's smirk slowly faded. She studied him, eyes narrowing slightly, as if searching for something, a tell, a flicker of pretense, any sign that this was merely an act of bravado. But she found nothing, only unwavering composure, a tranquility so unshakable that it was almost unnerving. For a brief moment, she felt as if she had lost control of the situation. She quickly regained her composure, but something had shifted. If, before, she had viewed this as nothing more than a game, a passing amusement, now there was an unfamiliar sensation creeping in, one that felt strangely like discomfort. Maintaining her professional demeanor, she retrieved her notepad and jotted down the order. But as she wrote, "Filet de Rossini, $350, a subtle realization settled in. This was not following the script she had expected. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough for a few nearby patrons to overhear. "Just to avoid any misunderstanding, I just want to make sure you're aware. This dish is $350. We wouldn't want any surprises when the check arrives." This time, she was certain the remark would provoke a reaction. But Keanu simply looked at her, his expression unchanged, then gave a slight nod. His voice remained as steady as before. "Appreciate the reminder." Ashley felt a small, inexplicable tightness in her chest. It wasn't that she doubted his ability to pay. It was something else, something about him that she couldn't quite put her finger on. Turning away, she walked back toward the kitchen, her pace just a fraction quicker than before. But the unease didn't fade. She didn't know why, but for the first time in a long while, she had a nagging feeling that this man, this seemingly ordinary man, was anything but. And that unsettled her. Ashley left with steps slightly quicker than usual, but even so, the discomfort creeping into her chest didn't lessen. She couldn't understand why that man's effortless confidence unsettled her so much. The scenario was supposed to play out the way she had envisioned. An outsider, someone who didn't belong in this place, would quickly realize they had no standing here, awkwardly opt for a cheaper dish, or, if they had any dignity, quietly leave without making a scene. But no, Keanu Reeves not only stayed seated, but also calmly. Ordered the most expensive item on the menu, completely unfazed by the situation she had deliberately set up. Clutching the order notebook in her hands, Ashley pressed her lips together briefly, but instead of taking Keanu's order to the kitchen, she hesitated. How ridiculous would it be to prioritize someone who didn't even deserve to sit in Lumiere? A man who looked like he had just stepped out of a rundown bus station, carrying nothing that matched the elegance of this place, sitting here so serenely as if he had every right to be served alongside the restaurant's wealthy clientele. Number Ashley couldn't accept that, and she certainly wasn't going to let things unfold the way he wanted. With a perfectly practiced fake smile, she made her way toward an elegantly dressed couple seated in the restaurant's central area. A man in a refined Tom Ford suit, beside a woman draped in a form-fitting evening gown, her diamond necklace catching the light from the crystal chandelier above. They were regulars at Lumiere, the kind of patrons Ashley believed truly deserved her attention. Stopping beside their table, she leaned in slightly, her voice dripping with sweetness. "My apologies for the wait. We've just received a special selection of wine today, an excellent pairing with your main course. I believe you'll both love it." The woman lifted her wine glass gracefully, her ruby-red lips curving into a satisfied smile, while the man beside her nodded approvingly, his eyes gleaming with appreciation for Ashley's attentiveness. Ashley basked in that moment, a silent affirmation that she was right. These were the customers Lumiere should cater to, the kind of people worthy of her care. Throughout it all, Keanu Reeves remained seated at his table, showing no signs of impatience or frustration at being ignored. He kept his relaxed posture, occasionally glancing around, his gaze drifting over the restaurant's decor, as if taking in every detail without the slightest urgency. Ashley passed his table several times but never once stopped or spared him a glance. Each time, she made a point of looking busy, ensuring it appeared as though the restaurant was simply too occupied for her to concern herself with an unimportant guest. Time continued to pass. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Keanu remained there, making no move to signal his growing impatience. He simply waited, as though time was of no consequence, as if he was accustomed to being treated this way, or perhaps as if he understood exactly what was happening, but had chosen to accept it with quiet composure. Ashley began to feel uneasy. By now, any other guest would have called her over, or at least shown some irritation at being made to wait so long. But Keanu did neither, and somehow that was more unsettling than any complaint she could have received. Across the restaurant, an older gentleman with neatly combed silver hair and an air of quiet refinement set his wineglass down on the table. He had been observing the situation from the beginning, his sharp eyes reflecting a thoughtful awareness as he watched Ashley deliberately ignore Keanu. He wasn't the type to interfere in others' affairs, but he also wasn't someone who could sit idly by while an injustice played out right in front of him. Slowly, he rose to his feet, adjusted his jacket, and made his way toward Keanu Reeves's table. No one in the restaurant took notice of his movement, except for Ashley. The moment she saw the distinguished older man approaching Keanu, a slight frown crossed her face. A vague, unsettling feeling began to take shape in her mind, an instinct telling her that something was about to shift beyond her control. And she was right. Everything was about to change. The elderly man slowly approached Keanu's table, his demeanor exuding the refined elegance of a gentleman who had lived long enough to understand the unspoken rules of high society. His deep, navy-tailored suit fit snugly over a body that, despite the unmistakable marks of age etched in the fine lines around his eyes, remained firm and commanding. His neatly combed silver hair and composed expression reflected the calm assurance of a man well-versed in life's intricacies, while his deep-set eyes carried the weight of someone who had already seen this entire story unfold from beginning to end. The soft thud of polished leather shoes met the wooden floor in deliberate, unhurried steps. neither rushed nor dismissive. Around him, a few perceptive diners began to take notice, turning their heads subtly to observe. There was something about him that naturally commanded attention. Not the ostentatious display of wealth through clothes or jewelry, but the quiet authority of someone who wielded true power. A power that stemmed from composure, confidence, and an intimate understanding of the world he inhabited. Stopping beside Keanu's table, he tilted his head slightly and offered a small, sincere smile, one devoid of the condescension or artificiality that many others in the restaurant wore. It was a smile of respect. "I see you've been waiting quite a while," he said, his voice deep and weighted with presence. "I just wanted to acknowledge a man with remarkable patience." His words carried effortlessly through the restaurant, not overly loud, yet clear enough for those nearby to hear. A few diners furrowed their brows, exchanging curious glances, uncertain of the implications. Keanu lifted his gaze, his expression remaining calm, though a flicker of amusement danced in his eyes. He parted his lips to respond, but before he could, another voice cut in, sharp, impatient. "Sir, I'm afraid you're disturbing our guest." Ashley. She had appeared from behind, her irritation barely concealed. The frustration had been simmering within her for some time, and now, with another guest unexpectedly interfering in what she believed was under her control, it flared even more intensely. She could not let this continue. The elderly man turned to face her, his gaze unperturbed but sharp enough that Ashley instinctively straightened her posture. For a fleeting moment, the air between them seemed to freeze, an unspoken standoff between experience and authority on one side, and arrogance and stubbornness on the other. Then, in a voice that was soft yet unmistakably firm, he replied, "Number, you're the one disturbing him." A brief silence blanketed the space. Ashley's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across her face. A few diners nearby paused their conversations, while others pretended to remain occupied with their meals, though their ears were undeniably tuned in. A wealthy couple at a neighboring table exchanged quick glances. The woman, swirling a cocktail in her hand, raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden turn of events. But no one was more affected than Ashley herself. Throughout her time working at Lumiere, she had always been the one in control, the one who decided who deserved impeccable service and who was to be treated as an outsider. Never had anyone challenged her authority. Never had anyone openly stated, in front of others, that she was the one behaving inappropriately. She had no immediate response. For a brief second, her lips pressed together, but her expression quickly shifted into a defensive justification. "I'm simply doing my job," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, though a faint tension betrayed her. "We have service standards here, and I'm only ensuring everything aligns with Lumiere's expectations." The elderly man studied her quietly for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. Then he gave a slow nod, not in agreement, but as if acknowledging her perspective before dismantling it. "If that is truly what you believe," he said, his voice lowering slightly, each word deliberate, "then I'm afraid you have completely misunderstood the essence of fine dining." This time, some diners couldn't suppress their curiosity, openly turning to watch the exchange unfold. A creeping sense of unease settled into Ashley's chest, though she maintained her composure, barely. Her fingers tightened around the serving tray in her hands, her knuckles paling. Keanu had yet to say a single word. He simply sat there, observing everything with an almost eerie tranquility, as if he had anticipated this exact sequence of events. The elderly man turned back to Keanu, his gaze softening, the gentle smile returning to his lips. "My apologies for the delay," he said with quiet sincerity. "I hope your experience here hasn't been too marred by unnecessary misunderstandings." Ashley felt a rush of heat flood to her face. His words landed like a slap, stripping away the authority she had carried throughout the evening. Finally, Keanu spoke, his voice calm, yet carrying a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "It's fine. I'm enjoying my dinner in my own way." A simple statement, yet one that left Ashley feeling as though she had just lost a battle she hadn't even realized she was fighting. And as the elderly man gracefully stepped away, leaving behind a lingering silence between Keanu and Ashley, she realized, perhaps for the first time, that she had completely lost control. Ashley stood still for a long moment after the older man left, her fingers gripping the serving tray tightly as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. Despite her best efforts to appear composed, she knew, everyone in the restaurant knew, that control was slipping from her grasp. The glances around her were no longer just indifferent, fleeting looks. They had transformed into lingering stares, whispers beginning to ripple through the air. Some diners, who had watched the entire exchange from start to finish, exchanged knowing nods and subtle glances filled with unspoken understanding. Ashley tightened her grip on the tray, forcing herself to swallow the frustration rising in her chest. But instead of backing down, she decided to strike again. If she couldn't make Keanu feel out of place, she would make sure he knew he would never belong here. As she stepped into the kitchen to retrieve the main course, Ashley deliberately took longer than necessary. She spent a few extra minutes chatting with the chefs, unnecessarily double-checking details, letting the dish sit under the heat lamp longer than it should, fully aware that doing so would compromise the perfect freshness of the sauce that the chefs had worked so hard to maintain. Only when she noticed that Keanu remained unfazed, sitting there calmly as if time was of no consequence, did she finally decide to bring out the dish. But instead of serving it with the professionalism and grace she reserved for the wealthy patrons, Ashley set the plate down with a deliberate force, causing a loud clack to echo against the wooden table. The velvety sauce in the filet de Rossini rippled slightly, nearly spilling over the edge. A few nearby diners flinched at the unexpected sound, and almost immediately hushed murmurs filled the air. But Keanu remained completely unbothered. He simply glanced down at his meal before lifting his gaze back to Ashley, his expression composed but sharp with silent observation. Ashley, aware of the disapproving glances from the surrounding tables, chose to push things further. "If this dish is too complicated for you," she said, her voice carrying just enough volume for others to hear, "we can bring you something more, suited to your tastes." It was more than just a taunt. It was an open insult, a veiled suggestion that someone like him couldn't possibly appreciate or understand a dish as refined as filet de Rossini. Several nearby diners turned their heads at once, some raising their brows in clear disapproval of her words. But Keanu Reeves didn't react the way Ashley had anticipated. He didn't appear flustered. He didn't get angry. He didn't even arch an eyebrow. Instead, he simply picked up his silver fork, cut into the perfectly cooked beef, and took a slow, deliberate bite, as if her words weren't even worth acknowledging. After swallowing, he looked up at her with a polite yet pointed smile. "Thank you," he said smoothly, "but this dish is excellent." His response, simple as it was, carried a weight that Ashley hadn't expected. No hesitation, no awkwardness, no sign of ignorance or insecurity, only absolute composure. So much so that her taunts suddenly felt meaningless. In that moment, the balance of power between them shifted entirely. Ashley felt her body tense, her fingers pressing against the tray once more. But this time, it wasn't anger that gripped her. It was unease. Around them, the quiet hum of conversation that had filled the restaurant earlier had begun to fade. People exchanged glances, small nods of acknowledgement passing between them as if they had just witnessed a lesson, one that Ashley, not Keanu, was meant to learn. A woman nearby, dressed in an elegant dark blue silk gown, arched an eyebrow before turning to the man beside her. She murmured with a faint, amused smile. He handled that so flawlessly that he humiliated her without even needing to say much. The man next to her nodded, taking a sip of his wine, his eyes still watching Keanu with subtle intrigue. None of them knew who Keanu Reeves was, but they could all sense one undeniable truth. This man was no ordinary person. Ashley was beginning to realize that as well. But instead of stepping back, she felt an overwhelming urge to regain control. She couldn't let someone like him turn the tables on her. She couldn't let this situation slip away from her grasp again. And so, she decided to escalate. She needed to do something stronger, something that would truly put him in his place. Something that would expose his lack of knowledge about this world. She had to prove that he didn't belong here. And so, standing there, under the scrutiny of the onlooking patrons, Ashley leaned in slightly toward Keanu, lowering her voice just enough to ensure that those nearby could still hear her. "I'm just a little curious," she mused, her tone laced with feigned politeness. "Have you ever had a dish like this before?" It wasn't an innocent question. It was a blade, sharp and deliberate, meant to slice through his dignity. But what Ashley didn't know was that she was the one about to learn a lesson she would never forget. Ashley's sarcastic question still echoed in the air, each word a firm declaration that Keanu Reeves did not belong to the world she so proudly considered herself a part of. But instead of leaving him flustered or uncomfortable, it only created an extended silence. Keanu maintained his calm smile, his gaze unwavering against Ashley's blatant provocation. But before he could respond, something unexpected happened that left the entire restaurant in stunned silence. The door leading to Lumiere's main hall suddenly swung open, and a middle-aged man with an air of authority stepped inside. He was dressed in a luxurious black suit, meticulously tailored to fit his frame, exuding an aura of professionalism and prestige. His sharp features carried a certain sternness, but his eyes reflected the keen awareness of someone well accustomed to managing high-end establishments. It was Lumiere's manager. The moment he spotted Keanu Reeves sitting there, his entire expression changed instantly. "Mr. Reeves." His voice wasn't loud, yet it was commanding enough to draw the attention of the entire restaurant. The murmuring guests who had been whispering about the encounter between Ashley and Keanu immediately fell silent, their gazes all converging on the small table where the unspoken confrontation had just taken place. The manager briskly made his way over, his face displaying a mix of deep respect and slight anxiety as he realized he had been unaware of the presence of such a significant figure. "My sincerest apologies. I had no idea you were here. Had I known in advance, we would have prepared a far more suitable welcome." His words sent a cold wave sweeping through the restaurant, leaving the nearby guests blinking in astonishment. A few even straightened in their seats, shedding the air of indifference they had displayed earlier. But no one was more shocked than Ashley. She froze in place, her eyes widening, her body momentarily paralyzed in sheer horror. "Mr. Reeves?" She repeated the name hesitantly, but the moment she did, as if a storm had suddenly torn through her mind, a slow yet crushing realization began to settle in. Her hand, still gripping the serving tray, trembled slightly. Her throat went dry, but she still refused to believe what she had just heard. And then, as if to eliminate all doubt, the restaurant manager turned, his face even more solemn as he officially confirmed the revelation that had plunged Lumiere into complete silence. "That's correct. Mr. Reeves is one of Lumiere's owners." For a moment, the entire restaurant seemed to freeze in time. The wine glasses that had just been raised were hastily set back down. The curiosity in the guests' eyes had transformed into pure shock. A few people subtly lowered their heads, as if this sudden truth had forced them to reevaluate their own actions. A hushed wave of whispers spread through the room, but no one dared to speak too loudly, as the atmosphere had grown unbearably tense. Ashley felt the blood drain from her face, her breath quickening, but no matter how desperately she searched for an excuse, there was nothing she could say to defend herself, because the truth was too cruel, too undeniable. She had not only disrespected a regular customer, she had insulted one of Lumiere's owners, right in the very establishment he owned. Every cell in her body screamed at her to say something, to explain something, but the words refused to form. They remained lodged in her throat, swallowed by a cold, suffocating emptiness. Yet, what terrified her most wasn't just the magnitude of her mistake. It was the expression on Keanu Reeves's face. He remained seated, still calm, still devoid of any visible anger or resentment. But it was precisely that composure that sent Ashley's fears skyrocketing. Because what was going to happen next? He could demand her immediate dismissal. With just a single word, he could destroy the career she had spent years building. And if he did, she wouldn't be able to contest it, because she had dug the very hole she was now falling into. But Keanu Reeves didn't do any of that. Instead, he gently set his knife and fork down, tilted his head slightly, and then spoke in a quiet, steady tone. His voice wasn't raised, nor was it overly forceful, yet every word carried enough weight to land like droplets of ice-cold water disturbing the still surface of a lake. "So, can we talk about how customers are treated now?" The question echoed in the absolute silence that followed, a question not just for Ashley, but for everyone in the restaurant. Ashley felt the world spinning around her. Everything had spiraled far beyond her control, and, for the first time that evening, she had no idea what to do next. The atmosphere in the restaurant was suffocatingly heavy. Keanu Reeves's question wasn't loud, nor was it harsh, but it carried a weight that silenced every other sound in the space. Every diner, whether they had been following the entire situation from the beginning or had only just realized what was happening, fell into stunned silence. The shock was still etched onto their faces, especially as they began to grasp who truly held the power in this restaurant. The manager of Lumiere, though striving to remain composed, couldn't completely mask the fury burning beneath his gaze. It wasn't the kind of loud, explosive anger, but rather a deep, bitter disappointment. The kind felt by a man who had prided himself on maintaining flawless service, only to see it tarnished by one of his own employees. He turned, locking eyes with Ashley, his gaze sharp enough to pierce through any excuse she might have had. His voice lowered, but it still rang clearly through the air, each word slicing into the arrogance she had always worn like armor. You think a customer doesn't deserve respect just because of their appearance. Ashley froze, her grip on the serving tray tightening until her knuckles turned white. Her throat went dry, her mind scrambling for a reasonable explanation, a justification that could salvage the situation, but nothing came. Her silence stretched too long, long enough for the manager to understand everything without needing to hear her response. But Ashley couldn't afford to remain silent. She had to say something, had to defend herself, had to prove she wasn't wrong. Her lips trembled, and when she finally spoke, her voice lacked the confidence it once held. I didn't mean it like that. I thought this place had certain standards, and I only wanted to protect Lumiere's image. The more she spoke, the more her voice wavered. Her words came out disjointed, losing the sharpness that had laced her earlier remarks toward Keanu. Now, all that remained were weak justifications, a desperate attempt to cling to whatever authority she had left. But her words held no weight anymore. The manager looked at her with deep disappointment. You think your arrogance protects this restaurant's image? Ashley flinched, realizing that every person in the room was watching her, not with admiration, as they once had, but with judgment, with disapproval, and even with disdain. Some guests shook their heads. Others whispered amongst themselves, their eyes saying everything that words did not. Everything she had once prided herself on, her authority, her control, her confidence in assessing others, was crumbling before her very eyes. And before she could figure out how to respond, Keanu Reeves, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. His voice was calm but firm, each word carrying an undeniable presence. There was no anger, no mockery, just a quiet strength that commanded attention. You don't have to be famous to be treated with kindness. That single sentence struck Ashley harder than any reprimand. Every gaze in the restaurant turned toward her, waiting to see how she would react. But, at that moment, Ashley had nothing left to say, because no excuse could change the fact that she had been wrong. The fact that she had not only mistreated a customer, but had also disrespected the very essence of hospitality, the very thing Lumiere prided itself on. She felt her entire world collapsing, but what terrified her the most was not knowing what Keanu Reeves would do next. He could demand her immediate dismissal. He could declare that she had no place standing here for even a second longer. And if that happened, her career would end right here, in this moment. But instead of doing any of those things, Keanu Reeves simply looked at her. His gaze no longer held scrutiny, only quiet disappointment. And that disappointment hurt more than any punishment ever could. Ashley felt her pride shatter, but this time she knew that no one could save her from this but herself. And the only question that remained was, would she learn from this moment, or would she continue to live in the arrogance she once believed was her strength? The Lumiere restaurant, when stripped of its noble and extravagant guests, when the clinking of wine glasses and proud conversations faded away, when the gentle melody of the piano no longer painted a picture of luxury, became eerily silent. But this silence wasn't the peaceful kind that followed a night of impeccable service. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of an inevitable reckoning, one that every staff member present had to face after everything that had happened. Under the warm glow of the golden lights, every employee, waiters, the head chef, bartenders, even the cleaning staff, stood in a long line. Their gazes no longer held the usual indifference. What had transpired tonight had left an imprint too deep to ignore, a tremor that no one could simply brush off. They stood there, unsummoned, yet knowing they had to be present. Ashley was among them. Her heart pounded in her chest. Stripped of her usual pride, her sharp gaze dulled. She was fully aware that she was at the center of tonight's events, but for the first time in her life, she didn't want to be. She didn't want all eyes on her, didn't want to. Be seen as the embodiment of blind arrogance, didn't want to acknowledge that she was the one who had made this mistake. Keanu Reeves hadn't called for this gathering, yet he stood there in the vastness of Lumiere, without urgency, without exerting authority, and yet his mere presence was enough to make everyone listen. His eyes scanned the room, not in anger, not in reprimand, but with something even heavier than blame. Quiet, profound disappointment. "I'm not here to chastise anyone." His voice was not loud, not harsh, not accusatory, but every word carried a weight that could not be ignored, as though they weren't just sentences but undeniable truths. I just want to remind us all of something that many seem to have forgotten. Respect is not a privilege reserved for the few. It is a fundamental right that everyone deserves. The silence in the room deepened, each person realizing that his words were not just a lesson, but a truth that had long been neglected. I understand that we work in a high-end restaurant. I understand that there are standards to maintain, expectations to meet, but that does not give us the right to judge someone based solely on their appearance. A restaurant is not defined merely by the quality of its food or the opulence of its space, but by how the people within it treat one another. His words struck like cold water poured over them, because they knew, whether they admitted it or not, they knew he was right. Ashley could no longer remain silent, but the confidence she once wielded was gone. No justification could shield her from this reality. For the first time in her life, she truly felt at fault, not just because she had insulted a powerful figure without realizing it, but because she had let herself be blinded by shallow prejudices for so long that she failed to see the weight of her own mistakes. Shame, regret, guilt. They all crashed into her like waves, each one stronger than the last. Her throat tightened. For the first time in all her years working here, she felt small. Her fists clenched as she tried to suppress it, but the tears came anyway. Slow, heavy, unstoppable. "I dot." Her voice cracked, no longer sharp or commanding, but trembling, fragile, a surrender to her own failures. "I'm sorry." The words fell from her lips like stones, each syllable dragging her pride down with them. She took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself, but the emotions within her surged too strongly. And then she admitted something she never thought she would. "I was so focused on appearances that I forgot the true worth of a person." The staff exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly, sensing the shift in the air. They had all seen Ashley for who she was before, had witnessed the way she treated guests she deemed unworthy, and they knew this apology did not come easily. Keanu Reeves remained composed. He neither pitied nor hastily forgave. He simply observed, as if waiting to see whether she truly understood the weight of her words. Ashley inhaled deeply, wiping away the tears, but she knew change wouldn't come overnight. Apologies could be uttered in seconds, but becoming a better person would take much longer, and she was willing to try. Lumiere had once been a symbol of luxury, but after tonight, perhaps it could become something more. A place where people were treated with fairness, not because of their wealth, but because they were human beings worthy of respect. Keanu gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that he had heard and understood this change. No public punishment was necessary. No harsh reprimand was needed, because this moment itself was punishment enough for Ashley, not because she had insulted Keanu Reeves, but because she had lost sight of her own kindness for far too long, and tonight she had finally found it again. The atmosphere in Lumiere restaurant remained eerily silent after Ashley's confession. None of the staff present that night dared to speak because they knew how crucial this moment was. This wasn't just a simple apology, nor was it an insincere attempt to salvage the dignity of an employee who had made a mistake. It was a turning point, a moment when a person stood face to face with the darkness within their own soul and was forced to choose the path they wanted to take next. Ashley remained standing there, her hands clasped lightly together, not out of fear, but because she knew that what happened next could change the course of her future entirely. She was ready to face the consequences, ready to accept that her mistakes deserved punishment, even ready to face the possibility of being fired on the spot. And yet, despite all of that, she still held on to hope, a fragile, desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she would be given a chance to make things right. Keanu Reeves, the man who had endured an evening of mistreatment at her hands, didn't rush to make a decision. He remained still, his gaze as calm as the surface of a still lake, devoid of anger, free of resentment, yet also offering no sign of leniency. He was assessing, observing, weighing whether the woman standing before him had truly understood the lesson she was meant to learn. Everyone assumed he would fire Ashley on the spot, that he would put an end to her arrogance and mistakes with a simple, unforgiving sentence: "You no longer work here." But Keanu did not. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locking onto hers, not with judgment, not with condemnation, but with a single question. A question that did not need to be spoken aloud yet echoed in the minds of everyone present. "Do you truly want to change?" Ashley swallowed hard, lifting her gaze to meet his, only to feel overwhelmed by what she saw. Not because it was frightening, but because it forced her to confront herself. No more hiding behind arrogance, no more justifications that made her feel right, no more excuses to shield her from the truth. She had been wrong. And then Keanu spoke. "I'm not going to fire you." The words were calm, yet they carried a weight no one could ignore. The other staff members stiffened slightly, exchanging glances of disbelief, unable to comprehend such an act of mercy. Ashley, too, was stunned, her eyes widening as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Keanu didn't let the moment linger. He continued, his voice steady and deep. "But you need to change." This time, Ashley didn't look away. She knew she couldn't just say sorry and expect everything to be forgotten. Forgiveness wasn't something that could be earned with empty words. Keanu stepped closer, not in a threatening or imposing way, but with a presence so firm that it demanded to be heard. "Change isn't something you need to prove to me. It's something you need to prove to yourself." He paused, letting his words sink in, making sure she understood that this was not a free pass, but a challenge. "I don't need you to act remorseful right now. I don't need you to pretend to change just to keep your job. What I need to see is whether you've truly learned something from tonight." Ashley felt her throat tighten, but this time she didn't feel like crying out of fear or shame. This time, it was because she realized this was an opportunity she never thought she would get. An opportunity to fix her mistakes. An opportunity to become a better person. An opportunity to rebuild everything from the ground up. She took a deep breath, then bowed her head, not out of fear, but out of sincerity. I promise to change and to work with my heart. Those words were not spoken lightly. They were a vow. A vow that she would never let arrogance blind her again. A vow that she would never judge anyone based on their appearance again. A vow that she would prove that change was real, not to please anyone else, but so she could look at herself in the mirror every day without shame. Keanu held her gaze for a long moment before nodding slightly, as if he had seen a flicker of something real within her, a spark of genuine transformation. He didn't say anything else, because from this moment on, only Ashley's actions could determine what would happen next. And she understood. There would be no second chance if she failed again. A new chapter had begun, not just for Ashley, but for the entire staff at Lumiere. They had come here to work, to serve, to provide luxurious experiences for their guests. But from this night forward, they would work with a different mindset, with a different heart. Because true excellence wasn't about expensive dishes or fine wines. It was about how people treated one another. It was about kindness. It was about respect, regardless of who you were or where you came from. And from this night on, Lumiere would truly become a place where anyone who walked through its doors would feel that. The atmosphere inside the Lumiere restaurant had returned to its familiar quiet, but something was undeniably different. Every staff member standing there, every person who had witnessed the events of this evening, felt a shift, an awakening, a profound reminder of the true meaning of respect and kindness. Ashley remained standing with her head bowed, her heart weighed down by the realization of her mistakes. Yet, amidst the heaviness, a small glimmer of determination had begun to shine, a flicker of hope for a new beginning. She knew that she couldn't undo her mistakes overnight, but she was ready to change, not to seek approval, but to rediscover herself. Keanu said nothing more, for he knew that the most important words had already been spoken. What remained now depended on the people here, on how they chose to treat others from this moment forward. True change never comes from words alone. It is forged through action. With a gentle smile, he nodded at the manager before turning away and walking out of the restaurant. As the large glass doors opened, a soft night breeze swept through, carrying the essence of freedom, of life's endless unpredictability. Keanu paused for a moment, standing at the threshold of Lumiere, his gaze lifting slightly as he took in the neon glow of Beverly Hills reflected against the night sky. The city moved on as if nothing had happened. Luxury cars continued gliding down bustling streets. Hurried pedestrians remained lost in their own busy worlds. Yet he knew that something truly important had shifted tonight. Perhaps something small, something imperceptible to anyone who hadn't been inside that restaurant. Because tonight wasn't just a lesson in respect. It wasn't merely an event that people would forget after a short while. It was an opportunity, a chance to change someone's mindset, a reminder that every person has the capacity to become better if they genuinely choose to. He stood there for a moment longer, inhaling deeply before letting out a quiet smile, as if reassuring himself that everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. Before stepping forward, he murmured a simple phrase, not directed at anyone in particular, but rather a message released into the night air, something for anyone to reflect upon. In a world where you can be anything, choose to be kind. And with that, he stepped onto the street, blending into the city lights as though he had never been there, as though the entire event had been nothing more than a fleeting moment in the endless current of life. Yet, he knew that what had happened tonight would remain etched in the minds of those who had witnessed it. A lasting reminder that kindness is always the right choice, no matter the circumstances. And at Lumiere, a place once known as a symbol of luxury, something far more valuable than opulence now resided, a lesson in humanity, in respect, and in how a person can change when they truly see the error of their ways. A new chapter had begun, and things would never be the same. The story at Lumiere was not just a lesson for Ashley, it was a reminder for all of us about the importance of respect and kindness. In today's world, where people are often quick to judge others based on appearances, on the clothes they wear, the cars they drive, or their social status, we easily forget one fundamental truth. The true value of a person cannot be measured by these things. Keanu Reeves not only demonstrated the power of humility, but also taught everyone that kindness should not be a privilege reserved for the wealthy or famous. It should be a fundamental standard for all people. And, above all, everyone deserves the chance to change and become better. So, what do you think about this story? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a similar situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story meaningful, don't forget to leave a like, share this video with those who might need to hear this lesson, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring story. Thank you for watching, and always remember, in a world full of choices, always choose to be kind.